Welcome to Inside the Apple Studio, a podcast that talks with architects to learn how they use Apple products in the practice of architecture, with your host, Neil Pan. Support for Inside the Apple Studio comes from Monograph. Monograph is the cloud-based practice operations solution built for architects by architects. Learn how Monograph can help you be more productive at monograph.com. Welcome to Inside the Apple Studio. In this episode, I'm excited to have an architect and entrepreneur whose career started during the Great Recession and has taken a very different path than one of a traditional architect. I'm pleased to welcome architect Zach Soflin to the show. Welcome, Zach.
Hi, it's good to be here, Neil.
Great. Thank you for joining me. Let's start off by hearing what inspired you to become an architect in the first place.
I knew I wanted to be an architect ever since high school. And I think CAD technology is really what got me interested in it from the beginning. So in high school, I remember taking a CAD class. I was working in tools like AutoCAD and Inventor and others. And I just remember really not being able to get enough of putting together things digitally on the computer. It was pretty empowering. It felt like, so I really took to that, and I got to credit one of my high school teachers who really taught me everything that I know about CAD. So I remember ever since early on in high school, I remember knowing, what I want to do is put buildings together.
Was that a class that you saw on the schedule and decided to take it, or was it part of another class that also did some CAD work?
So I remember it was actually a class that followed a hand drafting class. So I took hand drafting, and I liked it, but it was just something that I did. And then kind of a class that built on that was then the CAD class. And so I took that, and that right away kind of blew me away. Like, okay, this is pretty cool. I'm pretty passionate about this. So
what about drawing in CAD got you excited?
I think the biggest thing was just the possibilities that were there. I was never good, especially even in getting into college in my architecture degree. I was never good at sketching or hand drawing or anything else like that. But so I found the computer and CAD programs and modeling programs really empowering. That I might have something in my mind, and I could then get it out.
Yeah.
In that way. So I remember like building a really detailed like bike pedal submarine in Inventor, and hooking up all the pieces together, digitally, and making it actually work or turn. There's something about that just was empowering.
Sure. So after high school, you went on to attend the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Why did you choose to pursue your undergraduate degree in architecture there?
I grew up in a small town west of Lincoln, in Seward. And so I had always, like I said, in early on in high school, I knew I wanted to go into architecture. I don't know if I really knew what that meant, though. Architecture to me was designing houses and things like that. So I don't think I really knew what that meant exactly. So I ended up pursuing a associate's degree at a technical college in the area. And as I was kind of going through my gen eds and things like that, I realized, I think I want to focus more on commercial architecture and what that looks like. So I ended up applying at the University of Nebraska, which was relatively close. Again, not really knowing what I was getting myself into. And yeah, so I did not evaluate very many colleges when I was going through that decision. I just kind of went with that one because I was in the area.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, to stay close to home. It cuts down on the cost, I assume.
Yes, yeah, and I was actually married at that time as well. So I got married fairly young. So that was a key factor in our decision as well for me to pursue it there.
Now, you stayed another 2 years after receiving your undergraduate degree and received a master's from the same school. Did you consider attending a different school? And what about the master's program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln appealed to you?
No, I did consider attending other master's programs. I think a lot of my decision was kind of weighted on the connections and obviously the family that I had in the area. That's probably one of my bigger regrets, that I didn't like evaluate or try other options more at that time in my life. But ultimately, the master's program at the University of Nebraska was awesome. I really enjoyed my experience there and thought it was a really robust program.
What did you do for your master's thesis?
So my thesis focused on data-driven architecture. So I spent really that whole year focused on how we can make more data-driven decisions in our design system. So like the result of it was really focused on how can we essentially take a point, a location, a locational point somewhere in the world, and based on the context and the users of that particular building, kind of programmatically shape that building, through data like adjacencies to existing services or stores, things like that. What the like demographics of the area are and things like that. So we ended up building like a tool that would kind of automatically generate this using evolutionary problem solving algorithms that kind of would essentially understand the context and the users, and then generate kind of these schematic programmatic blocks of information. So it was really kind of interesting. When I started, I don't think I really knew where it was going to end up, but it ended up being a really interesting experience that kind of shaped, I think, the start and really the rest of my career in architecture, because that really got me interested in the design technology side of practice.
What inspired you to pursue that specific thesis?
In undergrad, especially, I had a couple professors that really challenged me to dive into visual scripting tools like Grasshopper and Dynamo. And I did, and I became really passionate about what that unlocked kind of on the design side of a project. Similar to kind of like my experience in high school, I think there's something really empowering about being able to create your own tools and generate really complex geometry with relatively little effort. So I think I realized during my undergraduate that I was really passionate about visual scripting and using those types of tools to create and generate architecture. So I knew that's really what I wanted to focus on for my thesis.
So what sort of tools did you build, or what sort of software did you use to build and do this analytics, if you will, for your thesis?
So it kind of started with Grasshopper. I don't know if you're familiar with Grasshopper, but it's a plugin to Rhino, which is a modeling program. And so I knew that I wanted to do something with parametric modeling tools. And so that's kind of where I started. But where my thesis kind of took me is into areas where there weren't kind of pre-built tools or components that you could utilize in parametric design tools. So I ended up having to build my own tools and plugins and things like that. So it kind of took me down the road of programming fairly quickly, and I ended up building ways that I could communicate with the Google Maps API to get restaurant locations or grocery store locations, all of that stuff, to kind of pull that location-based data to inform the model itself. So there were a lot of those types of things where I don't think at the beginning of my thesis I would have known that I would have gone down that track, but I was kind of forced to by just the direction my thesis was headed. So
what programming language were you using to do that?
So I started using Python, which is a pretty good entry level programming language for especially like in architecture. It's a good starting point for programming. So I use a lot of Python, but I ended up toward the end of my thesis. Really, one of the results of the thesis was this residential tower that essentially users would be able to use an app on their phone and essentially select preferences about their particular unit. It's just a way to kind of get information. And so they would submit answers to questions like, what's your preference on height? What's your preference on views outward? What direction do you want to face? And then they could actually start to lay out kind of modules for what their unit needed to look like kitchen and bedrooms and living areas and stuff like that. And so once those were submitted, the whole point was that the program that I built would take all that information and it would start to negotiate all of those priorities and mix them together into one kind of tower. And so in order to do that, I had to learn a myriad of different tools. So I ended up using JavaScript and HTML to build a web application that would allow users to submit and design this data. Like I said, I use Python for a lot of the backend stuff that was actually doing the analysis and like putting it all together. And then ultimately used like Grasshopper and Rhino and a myriad of other tools to actually like visualize it in general. So yeah, it was pretty cool experience.
So while you were doing all of this and pursuing your master's, you actually worked at the same time at BVH Architecture. How did you approach working and going to school at the same time during your master's?
For me, like I think I started at the beginning of my fourth year of architecture school, working at BVH Architecture, and all throughout the rest of my education, I worked part-time. I think I averaged around 20 to 25 hours a week. And for me, that was actually really valuable because I mean, I can only speak to my experience, but one thing that's really lacking in academia is really the professional side and the professional experience of the industry. And so obviously students get that when they come out of school and move into a practice. But for me, it was really interesting to kind of experience those things simultaneously. So I'd be at work for 20 to 25 hours a week, worrying about things like RFIs and different like technical problems that come up on a project. And then obviously the other end of that in school, worried about the more academic side of design. So for me, it was actually it worked out really well and gave me kind of a well-rounded experience, I think.
Did you ever feel that because you are working, that some of your projects that you are working on, it might not have been exactly like this for you, since you were working on, especially during your thesis, on such a data-driven sort of thesis, but did you ever think that the reality of, can I build something, limit your design abilities while you were in college?
That's a good question. I think that was definitely a factor for me in school, but in particular with my thesis, I kind of enjoyed since I was also working at a firm, I kind of enjoyed the freedom of academia that not that everything that you design was unfeasible to build, but that limitation was nice to not have to worry about, I guess. And especially I think especially within a thesis, like you're looking at kind of a larger problem or idea than just like how I can practically execute or build on this particular building. Mine in particular wasn't really about a single building or location. It was really about the idea behind how we arrive at that. So yeah, for me, I think I liked the freedom that academia provided me.
So as someone who has received their license to practice architecture in 2016, what was that process like? And how did you prepare, or how did you balance work and taking exams at the same time?
I procrastinated quite a bit on taking the exams, which I think is fairly typical. But I remember deciding one January, well, in probably 2015, that, you know what, I just need to knock this out and get it done. And so I actually had a group of two other guys that were in my office that I was pretty good friends with, that were similar age, unlicensed, still needed to take their exams. We kind of all started at the same point. So having that community around it and accountability made it a little bit easier. We kind of worked together to take our exams. I think we all failed at least one throughout the process, but I think within a year, we all three finished relatively close together. So it was a good experience to just have other people to go through that with.
Did you study as a group?
No, not really. We all had kind of different study methods, I think, or like, I guess, ways that we retained the information. I remember like for my first test, putting in way more time than I would have needed to. And by the last couple, I realized, if I spend if I spent the time, and basically what I ended up doing with my last couple is I would schedule the exam a week out and then spend 2 hours a night essentially reading as many pages as I could of the study guides. And then I would end up taking the test with wherever I left off. And that strategy actually worked out fairly well for me. I didn't put a whole lot more into studying. Everyone kind of did it differently.
Yeah. What sort of gap between exams did you give yourself?
I think that varied quite a bit. So actually, I'll correct this. That my first exam I failed that I remember, and that was the schematic design test. And the schematic design test, it's different now, but back then you had to actually use their CAD software to lay out a building essentially based on the programming requirements and everything else like that. And I remember doing that and studying a ton for it. It went really well. But I remember in the test in the last 3 minutes, I realized, oh shoot, I think I have a minor error here because I'm not meeting this program requirement. And so I had about 3 minutes left, and I was like, okay, I think I can fix this. And I started moving stuff around in the CAD program, and time was ticking down. And I got down to 20 seconds, and I was like, dang it, I'm not going to be able to put this, finish this. I'm just going to undo everything I did really quick. And I tried doing it. And at the very end of it, the clock ticked out, and I realized I looked at the screenshot, and I had a giant wall straight down the middle of one of my corridors, which basically meant that I had 2 giant dead end corridors. And I knew right at that minute I failed it. And so after that test, I remember being pretty demoralized, and I don't think I took another one for a good month or two. But then after that, my second exam, I studied pretty hard for. I passed that one, and then I tried to knock one out basically every month.
Okay.
Essentially. So yeah, it was an interesting process.
Well, it sounds like you had a good methodology of an approach. I'm curious, what materials did you use to study with?
Oh, I think it was Kaplan. I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
They had a lot of basically a big book for each one. So yeah, I think that's what I used.
Were those materials supplied by your employer?
They were, yeah. They actually had all that study material. BVH Architecture actually reimbursed me for every test that I passed. So most of it was covered by the organization as well. So that was good.
Nice. So let's talk a little bit about BVH Architecture. What sort of projects were you working on during your time there?
So ever since, even as an intern, I pretty early found kind of my niche in the design technology side of projects. And I think the first one I can kind of think of is, well, first of all, BVH works on a myriad of different project types. So they do everything from K through 12 to higher ed, civic projects, a lot of like preservation projects, adaptive reuse, all kinds of different project types. So where I kind of found my niche, even as an intern, was building out solutions to problems on specific projects. So one of my first projects that I worked on was the Haymarket Arena in Lincoln. It was a big arena basically that we were working on with several other firms. And one of the problems was the top of this, they called it the drum of this building. It was probably about a third of the facade of the building, essentially, was kind of a doubly curved surface. And we didn't have a great way to create that in the tools that we were using, just Revit. Basically, we didn't have a great way to create that geometry. And so as an intern, I was tasked with how could we make this easier to generate, because essentially we were creating iterations of this time and time again. I think we went through like 80 plus iterations of what this needed to look like. And so I ended up building a Grasshopper script that essentially took the 4 ellipses that were provided to us and then generated all of the panels, the interior wall, the studs, the windows, those types of things, so that essentially we could make changes to that geometry and the parameters of that geometry, and then automatically regenerate the geometry. So I think that was kind of my first project where I think BVH recognized that there's a lot of value in these design tools, these design technology tools. And so I think I was kind of, well, pigeonholed sounds like a negative term, but like that's really where my niche was at. And that's really what I focused on the rest of my career. So I did a lot of that we worked on the Gateway Arch survey and restoration. And I worked on solutions for that, all the way to like small meeting centers that needed solar analysis and thin solutions and I don't know, all kinds of different things. So
really solutions that you were working on during your time in college.
exactly. Yes, exactly right. Yep.
Now, one of the rehab projects that you worked on led to the creation of what is now Layer. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to know, how did this in-house project begin, and talk about how that became Layer and you as its founder and CEO.
Yeah, that's a great question. So BVH has been working on the Nebraska State Capitol for, I think, close to like 30 or 40 years. The Nebraska State Capitol goes through basically 10-year incremented projects where they'll focus on the interior, then the exterior, then the interior, then the exterior. And so BVH has been working on all of those, pretty continuously, basically. So the most recent project to come up was the HVAC replacement project, where basically it was an interior project where they're going to rip out all of the old HVAC equipment and replace it with new equipment. And so we started that project, and this was right around the time, I think it was like 2016, somewhere in there. And we hadn't previously had a BIM model of this project, and so we had a couple members of our team used old drawings and went over to the Capitol, took measurements, all of those types of things, and essentially built and assembled a really detailed BIM model for this, so a Revit model. And so then I got brought onto that project when we went into really the design phase, where we needed to basically collect all of the information about the existing condition of the building now, and then design the solutions for it later. And so what we had to do is we had to go in to the Capitol and basically do a full condition assessment of the entire building. Now, we typically do this with notepads, clipboards, digital cameras, things like that. But looking at this project really quickly, we realized like the scale and multiplicity of this project wasn't going to allow us to approach this in the way that we had before. So, and really just because there was around 1,300 rooms. So gathering interior photos of 1,300 rooms and finding what we were looking for, doing this the traditional way wasn't going to work. And we kind of knew that going into this. This was evident just by the sheer amount of data that we ended up gathering at the end of it. After everything was said and done, we ended up with like 39,000 photos, interior photos of the building.
Wow.
I think we collected around 100,000 pieces of unique data about the building as well. Things like, what's the wall material on the west wall in Office 1200, and what's its condition? Is it preservation worthy? All of those types of things we needed to know. Again, with 1,300 rooms, it became really daunting really quickly. So with my background, I started really thinking about how we could solve this problem. And I realized, we had this really detailed BIM model where we had geometrically, a lot of the information was there. Like we knew what rooms were where, we knew where walls were located, windows were located, all of those types of things. What we didn't have is a connection to all of this real world data that we had to gather out in the field. So essentially I end up building a prototype that would essentially was a Revit add-in that would connect to our model, extract the objects that we cared about attaching information to, objects like rooms or windows, and then make those available on mobile devices, so that we could basically take those mobile devices into the field, walk into a room, Office 1200, and snap 15 photos of the room, looking around, and then gather all of the data related to that particular room, like what the wall material was or what the floor condition was, all of those different types of things. And so essentially, as you were gathering the information, all of it inherently had context. It knew where it was located in the building because it was attached to these elements from our model. So it made collection a lot easier. But then on the other end of that, it made referencing it a lot easier as well, because as part of what I ended up building was a dashboard in Revit where, as you navigated around your model, clicking on a room or a door or a window, our prototype would actually pull up automatically all the related information to that. So if you clicked on a room in Revit, you would see all of the photos related to that room, basically eliminating the gap between the real world data that we needed to design and the actual design tools that we were working in.
Now, how long did it take you to build this prototype?
so I have to credit BVH and particularly the capital project team on this, because they were incredibly brave to essentially put their trust in an architect who was not a software developer and who was saying that he could build this thing to collect and manage all of this data, but didn't have a fully working copy of it yet. Because basically over the next, once I kind of introduced that idea, over the next couple months, I would say, I got to building the core components of it. So the first one was extracting the data from the Revit model, and that took relatively little time to do, maybe within the week. But then being out in the field and actually collecting the data, that took several months to kind of build that out. And I kind of built it in pieces as we needed it. Mm-hmm. And so I remember distinctly, being in the office and getting a phone call from one of the people surveying the building, or maybe the project manager, Julie, who's over there and can't get something to work. And so I remember, getting in my car, driving over to the Capitol, having an iPad on the back of my trunk of my car, debugging problems and redeploying a new app to it, and all of this stuff. So again, the team was incredibly brave to embark on that journey, and I think it ultimately paid off. That we saved a ton of time.
So you had to become a programmer, essentially.
Yeah. It was something that I think I realized, like, as I was getting more and more into it, it's like, man, this is really empowering. I can really build anything without compromise. There's just something about that really drew me in, and I realized I was really passionate about it.
So take us from that prototype to the creation of Layer and where you are today as its CEO.
I continued on that project we probably continued building it and iterating on that for at least a year from that point, never really thinking that it would go anywhere other than just for this particular project. But as we moved out of the collection phase of the project and into the design phase of the project, we ended up inviting all of the team members, mechanical, electrical, engineers, structural engineers, to the prototype, and allowing them to view this data alongside their models. I mean, we had a team of, I think, 30 people that were all using and referencing this information without having to go back over to the site and look for this data about the existing building. And so at that point, we realized, I think we're solving a much bigger problem than just on the Capitol. Mm-hmm. And it was at that point that I started having conversations with leadership at BVH about, what, I think we should take this and try to bring this to market.
And what was their reception to that? I mean, we know the answer, but what was their initial reception?
I think that they were surprisingly open to it. They saw the response from the project team and the applications. And I mean, one of the biggest benefits that we have is where we started is we have this great origin story of the Capitol, where, like, this was literally born out of a problem that just about anybody can relate with who's worked on a design project. So the question wasn't, at least from their mind, and even mine, the question wasn't whether it was going to be valuable in the market. I think the biggest question that we had to answer is, where are we going to take this and what we're going to focus on? Is this just going to be a tool for condition assessments and facility audits, or does it have bigger application? And so we had to really pick a point on the spectrum of where we wanted to go, and we chose to really focus on building a flexible BIM connected tool first, versus just a tool for condition assessments or just a tool for facility audits. So they were surprisingly open to it, and we ended up just kind of taking it one step at a time. We talked with a lawyer about how we could make this happen. We ended up forming a separate organization and just kind of marching down that path to building out a final version that we could eventually launch.
So what is Layer today?
Question. So Layer is a flexible BIM connected platform that allows users to build hyper customized workflows for their building projects. So we really focus on giving users a toolkit where they can create their own hyper customized workflows and processes for their companies or projects. So it's kind of starting where we did. Condition assessment is an example of a workflow that you can create in Layer. But if you think about that, like just if any architects who have done a condition assessment, that based on the company that's doing it, the scope of the project, all kinds of different requirements dictate collecting totally different information. And so we realized really quickly, even on the capital, that there has to be a level of flexibility to allow users to create kind of their own properties or fields that they're gathering. A good example of this is on the capital. We ended up kind of hard coding in all of the questions that we were answering in the condition assessment. And so every time the project manager would come to me and say, hey, this question actually needs to read this way, or we need to change this to a true false question, or all of those different types of things, I'd be making these changes. And quickly I realized, why don't we just empower the user to be able to create these different fields and customize them rather than kind of pre-building them into our system. And so starting at that place with the condition assessment and like the necessity of flexibility in that, I think is what led us to today kind of focusing on building this flexible BIM connected platform first.
So Layer is a web app, essentially. I may be oversimplifying, that you can access from any platform, essentially.
Yeah, it's you can access it from any platform, and we do have a web application. You can also download native apps for iOS, Android, Mac, Windows, and then, like you said, you can access it on the web. You also can access it; it's directly built into Revit, a add-in as well. So we're basically on every platform, and that's one of the major tenets of what we do. We think that accessibility and transparency is what leads to better project collaboration.
As much as you can say, where do you think the future of Layer is headed? And in a larger sense, the future of architecture documentation?
Yeah, good question. Layer really is where we're going with this. Is we see a ton of value in centralizing all of your project data in one location. That's incredibly hard to do now, but really our aspirations are to be a common data environment for buildings. We want to be the source of all of that building data, whether it's in design, construction, or operations of a building. And so obviously, like now, especially, there's a lot of talk of like digital twins and things like that. But if you look at there's a recent survey by a facility management group that just looked into the hurdles or challenges in using BIM data in operations of a building. And a lot of those challenges focus around just the high barrier of entry that it takes to actually use BIM software, whether it's Revit or ArchiCAD or whatever it is. In general, those are desktop only products. In general, it's fairly limited in what information you can connect to objects in there. You have to have generally a lot of training or know-how about how to use the software. And it's software that's not really created for like referencing or summarizing or visualizing information. And so that's where our aspirations really are, is to be that connection point and to make it way easier to access your building data from anywhere.
I want to go back and talk a little bit about when you completed your undergraduate degree in 2010, the industry was still dealing with the effects of the Great Recession. Where did you think your career in architecture would take you at that time?
Back in 2010, I remember starting at BVH, and yeah, that was at a time where like jobs were pretty scarce. I ended up like during the summer, I think, of that year, commuting to BVH's Omaha office, which for me was about an hour and a half drive every day. And so I ended up doing that commute, knowing that that wasn't really sustainable, but like I wanted to get the experience and the practice, and obviously I needed money to keep me going through college. And so I ended up working with someone at BVH on most of their projects, and he taught me a lot about what the process of architecture looks like. He was a great teacher. He taught me a lot about like just practically how the profession works. Again, it's things that you aren't exposed to in academia. And so at that point, I really wasn't. I wasn't sold out on architecture and design. I saw a lot of like, I mean, that summer, I guess for me was disillusioning, I guess I would say. But once the semester started back up, I was fortunate enough they transferred me to the Lincoln office, which is in the same city, obviously, as the college I was attending. And right away, I got started on the Haymarket Arena project. That was a project that was just starting up. So I think for BVH and for me, that project was a lifesaver in a way, because we were scarce on work, I believe, just like just about everybody was. And that project for BVH, at least, I mean, gave them plenty of padding, because it was a very large project. But for me as well, it kind of solidified where I wanted to go with my career. And that was really focusing on design technology and building solutions for projects.
So in your case, you're no longer practicing as what we might define as a traditional architect. Mm-hmm. When you entered college, you had a vision of what the profession might be, or you had an idea of what it was. How has that reality been different from where you thought it was going to be?
So I think, and this is probably similar for a lot of architects, but I remember in school, especially, there's very little compromise that you have to do on academic projects. And I think that was one of the more disillusioning things getting into the just practice in general, is the level of compromise that has to happen specifically to like a design idea, right? Like to me, that was one of the more disillusioning things getting into practice. Cause I thought like in school, especially, that like, I looked at architecture firms in the area, or and then I, as opposed to, famous architects around the world, like Diller Scofidio and, all of those types. And I remember questioning, like, why don't these local firms do this type of rigorous work, versus like some of these others? And it was just naive on my part. But getting into practice, I then quickly understood the dynamics of a project and the way that design projects tend to get diluted as an idea moves down the line of design, delivery, construction, those types of things. So it was very different, and I think disillusioning to me when I got into practice.
Well, hopefully not. It certainly didn't discourage you from going on and getting your license and practicing for a short while, and led to a career doing something really different.
Yeah, definitely. No, and that was the cool part, is I think I found, like, especially in the area that we were in, a lot of the clients we were working with were really pragmatic, right? Like, I mean, focused on like, how can I get the most value for my money? And so on my side of things, where I found a lot of interest is using parametric design tools and design technology tools to justify expenses to a project. So like, I remember working on a small project called the Nature Conservancy, and the main face of this building kind of faced southwest. So you can imagine, but at the same time, the owner wanted expansive views outward toward the river and the prairie and stuff. So you can, it's those types of negotiations that like you have to figure out how to solve for all of these different priorities. And so we ended up using evolutionary problem solving and parametric modeling to one, design a solution, but then two, show the owner why this was valuable and why it was, we attributed value to these design decisions. And so for me, I found a lot of interest in that. Like, I mean, realizing that, okay, we have really pragmatic clients. How can I use these tools to justify these design decisions that we're making?
Well, wow, it's been quite a journey for you. So let's take a short break. And after, we'll explore a little bit more about your experience with the Mac and other Apple products right after this. How do you manage your firm? Are you using dated and clunky software? Are you frustrated using spreadsheets and never really getting a clear view of the status of your projects? Then I'm happy you're listening, because inside the Apple Studio sponsor Monograph can help. Designed by architects for architects, Monograph allows you to track your time, your projects, and your budgets, and you can do it all in real time. They have a feature called Money Gantt, and with this awesome tool, you can immediately see whether you are under or over budget on a project, along with their new tool, Resource, which allows you to reallocate your team's time and track its impact on your remaining budget. You can easily adjust your projects on a week-to-week basis. Monograph makes this easy. So help support Inside the Apple Studio by checking out Monograph at monograph.com. Be proactive with Monograph. Welcome back. Zach, your architecture path has led you down a very different than a traditional architect, and thank you for sharing all of that. Now let's discuss how you started using a Mac and eventually other Apple products. How were you first exposed to the Mac, and what was the first Mac you used or owned?
So I was always a Windows user all through all my childhood. My dad, had a had a Windows computer. I had one in high school, and obviously, like as I was in high school, I was really interested in CAD and things like that. And most of those programs were only made for Windows machines, and so I actually didn't really use a Mac early on in my life. But I've always been drawn toward like high design and well designed products and really just things. And so that's something that's always really attracted me to Macs in general. And so I remember early on in my career at BVH, kind of wondering what the hurdles were to using a Mac instead of a PC. And so obviously really quickly I realized that tools like Revit and other tools like that weren't made for Mac. And so that was obviously an immediate limitation, but I still convinced BVH to buy me a MacBook anyway. And I ended up using tools like Parallels and Boot Camp to still run my production software, but also have the experience of a Mac. And like I said, I think the biggest thing for me, like, I like high design and like well-designed products. And so that's something that's always interested me about Macs in general.
So when you were doing a lot of the data analysis during your master's thesis, were you using a PC for that at the time?
I was, yep. I was using a PC. Yep. Yeah. And in general, most of the tools that I was using was on a PC.
So how in the world did you convince BVH to buy you a MacBook?
Well, first of all, I believe my initial argument for it was that I needed to be able to deploy an iOS app for the prototype of Layer for the Capitol. And so I had to and in order to do that, just for some context, in order to deploy iOS apps and use Xcode to actually build iOS apps, you have to actually be on a Mac. You can't do it from a Windows machine. So
right.
I think that's initially how I convinced them to do it. But then I obviously let them know how I was planning to set it up on Parallels and others, and found some articles online to help justify it a little bit too.
Okay. All right. So it was really the fact that you had to create an iOS app for what the prototype you were working on really kind of led that. But at the same time, you could argue I can still do everything else that everyone does on a Windows PC through things like Parallels if there's an app that would not work, for instance, natively on the Mac.
Yep, exactly.
When you were creating this app, you had to use a Mac to create the iOS app side of that app. Are you continuing to use a Mac then in the creation of Layer?
Yes, I'm on my second MacBook. so far, and I continue to be a Mac diehard. Now, I don't think I'm ever going back.
Well, that's good to hear. Hopefully, our audience appreciates that.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier, Layer has apps across all the platforms: Mac, iOS, Windows, and Android. Now, on the Windows side, there's a Revit add-in. What benefits does that have? And do you see a benefit in adding a similar type of add-in to a program, say ArchiCAD or other Mac BIM apps?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, Layer connects to Revit really to do two things. One, extract pertinent data from your Revit model, things like rooms, windows, doors, specialty equipment, all of that type of stuff. Extract it from your model and bring it into the Layer platform. And then two, bring Layer data back into the Revit environment. So it's really a two-way street for that information. So we started with Revit because it is the predominant tool, BIM tool in the United States. I think roughly, I think it's like 80%, 70%. I don't recall exactly what the statistic is, but it's a large majority of architects and engineers who are using BIM are working in Revit in the United States. And so that's really where we started. However, our objective really is to support all BIM platforms eventually. So we do support like IFC files,
Okay.
Which you can get out of tools like ArchiCAD and others. But as far as actually like integrating into the software itself, we do have ArchiCAD integrations planned, and Vectorworks is another one. So we do plan on supporting those eventually as well.
So BVH was all PC.
Mm-hmm.
Now with Layer, you're using a Mac. Does everyone else who's involved with Layer also using Macs?
So we have, let's see, everybody at Layer is using a Mac, including we just hired someone who is starting with us in a couple of weeks, and he just told us that he is planning to use a Mac. So everyone at BVH uses a Mac except for one of our developers. So we do give people the choice. They can choose whichever platform they want, mostly because most of the tools we're using are platform agnostic, but everyone else is using a Mac except for one of our developers who's a diehard Windows fan.
Okay. So at Layer, what sort of applications or services do you use to manage the operations there?
Yeah, so we use everything from for like accounting and things like that. We use QuickBooks Online. We use tools like Stripe to collect payments and send invoices and all of those types of things. Really, all of the tools that we use are web-based tools for the most part. So a lot of the like production tools that we're using are things like VS Code and others. We use Slack to communicate with our team and with outside parties as well.
Having a small firm, how many people are at Layer One, and how do you manage contacts, calendars, kind of some of the day-to-day sort of things that you have to be able to do?
So we have 6 employees today. We've got, I think, 3 job applications out there right now. So we're looking to grow our team even more. In general, what we use as a team, especially with just like managing all of our contacts and relationships and things like that, is HubSpot. HubSpot's kind of our central database for all of our customer information. So we use HubSpot to communicate, to do all of our like marketing campaigns, things like that, with sales communications, emails. We use it for servicing and support tickets, things like that. So that's kind of our central hub of information.
What are some of the favorite things that you like about using a Mac and other Apple devices?
So I remember it was probably, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago is when I got my first iPhone. I'd always been an Android user before that. And I remember it being a interesting transition because there were things that I missed about Android, but really quickly I realized that like buying into the Apple ecosystem of Apple devices was magical in a lot of ways. Like just like that's one thing that I loved about, like once I bought a Mac and once I had an Apple TV and an iPad and all of those things, all of it just seamlessly works together and seamlessly syncs together. And that's the thing that I think has impressed me most about just Apple's ecosystem is they do a really good job of integrating all of their products together. So and it just works. Like that's the great part about it, is it just works.
Right. So for those listening, what advice would you give if they're considering using a Mac in their office?
So when I first bought a Mac and convinced BVH to buy me a Mac, I convinced, I think, 3 or 4 others to also buy a Mac, or get a Mac at BVH as well. And we kind of tested out how we could start to use Macs in practice. And right away, one of the big things that we realized was parallels in particular gave us a lot of issues when we were running Revit. And so ultimately we ended up switching to Boot Camp, which obviously is less convenient because you actually have to restart your machine to go into Boot Camp, but it was way more performative, especially when we were using tools like Revit. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that we started to do is look for, okay, so some of the tools that we need that are running on Windows, are there alternatives to them that we could use on Mac? And so Revit is one that obviously we couldn't find use an alternative or switch over our firm to a tool like ArchiCAD or something else like that. But we did find a lot of alternatives for other tools kind of in our toolkit. One of them was Bluebeam, which used to support Macs, but no longer is supporting Mac environments. And so we would use tools like Acrobat, which are way less efficient. This is prior to like Layer. We've used tools like that. The same with like our file servers. We ended up kind of suggesting and piloting, well, what if we started to store our project data on tools like Google Drive or Dropbox, rather than these local file servers that are always either going down or having trouble accessing via VPN or whatever else. And so it kind of started as kind of this small pilot of, and really because we wanted to replace or utilize a Mac, that we ended up using tools like Google Drive. And ultimately now BVH, the firm, has now transitioned completely off of physical servers and onto Google Drive as a primary project repository and storage. So our interest in evaluating how you could actually use a Mac in practice led to, this 50+ person firm moving from physical servers altogether and moving to Google Drive, other tools.
Wow. And Ed, I assume they found it cheaper to do that?
Yeah. Yes. We had several, and I'm sure there's plenty of people who have similar experiences, but we were working with like a managed IT service that would, we would pay them monthly and they would worry about all of our IT setup and all of that stuff. And we had several catastrophic events that catastrophic as in like the server would just go out and we'd have to wait a week to access anything on that while they repaired it. And
wow,
those types of things that just like it caused so much headache in maintaining those that we were like, you know what, I think it's worth it to us to move these to a more reliable system. So yeah, that's what we ended up doing, and it worked out pretty well. I think they're pretty happy with it.
All because of a small team that wanted to use a Mac. All because of you.
Yep, basically.
You that wanted to first use a Mac.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and that's the interesting part too, is we're going down this road of how do we make all of our project information more accessible from anywhere. This is all pre-pandemic, but by the time the pandemic rolled around and we were ready, they were moving into, full remote work. They were prepared. They didn't have to do any transition over because everyone had laptops. Everyone had access to all of the project files. They were using tools like Slack and others to communicate. So I think we're really fortunate in that way that we didn't have to rush around trying to figure out how we were going to patch this all together and make it accessible remotely.
Right. Well, Zach, I really appreciate you sharing your Mac and Apple experience. And before we wrap up this section, I'd like you to share with the audience one app, utility, or service that you find most useful.
Well, good question. I would say Product Board is probably my favorite app or utility. And Product Board is a roadmap planning tool. It's a beautiful tool that we use to map out all of our features and kind of the roadmap and overall direction of Layer. And so that's probably my favorite.
Is that an iOS app?
It's a web app, so you can access it anywhere. Yep.
All right, great. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Now let's get on to our final segment, the 10 questions. So our first question is, what is your favorite word?
What is my favorite word? Yes. Yes is my favorite word. And alternatively, no is my least favorite word.
That's the next question. So no is your least favorite word. Okay. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I'd say problems that demand a solution. So like big problems. Those really get me going. Like just thinking about the opportunity there. I think.
What turns you off?
I would say like the attitude of we've always done it this way. Well, we've always done it this way.
What sound or noise do you love?
I would say the the wind through the trees. We live on it. We live on an acreage here, and there isn't much better than kind of walking around and listening to the wind blowing through the trees as walking around the property.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Nails on a chalkboard. That's always been my least favorite.
What is your favorite curse word?
I use crap a lot, I think. So I would go with that.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Oh, I think it'd be really interesting to be a pilot. That would be cool.
What profession would you not like to do?
Anything that doesn't take a whole lot of like critical thought or application, like mindless work. I would have a really hard time doing that, I think.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrived at the pearly gates?
Well done, good and faithful servant. That's for sure.
Zach, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this episode of Inside the Apple Studio. Let the listeners know where they can find you online.
Yeah, you can find me at our website, layer.team. So it's layer.team. And you can always email me too at zach@layer.team.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining me, Zach. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil. I appreciate the time.
I have been your host, Neil Pan, and thank you for listening to this episode of Inside the Apple Studio. I'd like to thank my guest, Zach Soflin, for joining me, and Monograph for their support. Learn more about Monograph at monograph.com. Find the show in your favorite podcast player by searching for Inside the Apple Studio, and help support the show by leaving a 5-star rating and comment in Apple Podcasts. You can also support the show by telling a friend. This is the best way to help the show grow. Remember to follow the show by selecting the follow button in Apple Podcasts or in your favorite podcast app. You can find me on Twitter at NPANN or the show at Apple for Arc. That's Apple FORARCH. Inside the Apple Studio is a production of Apple for Architects at appleforarchitects.com.